If there's one name we can all agree belongs at the very top of the greatest guitarists of all time, it's Eric Clapton. The man didn't just play British rock, he redefined it. From the Yardbirds to Cream and beyond, Clapton set a standard so high, even legends had to look up. And to this day, no one's quite matched the soul, skill, and raw emotion he poured into every riff. But behind the spotlight, beyond the standing ovations and platinum records, lies a darker thread, a deep, unresolved bitterness that Clapton still carries. Because for all his fame and fortune, there's one person he's never forgiven, one person he truly, deeply despises. So, who is this figure haunting Clapton's legacy? Join us as we peel back the layers of heartbreak, rivalry, and twisted love that still shadow his life. But before we get into the emotional wreckage, let's rewind to where it all began, to the origin story of the man who would become a guitar god, Eric Clapton. A complicated beginning. Eric Clapton was born on March 30, 1945, in the quiet village of Ripley, Surrey, England. His arrival into the world came with a secret and a twist of fate that would define his early years. His mother, Patricia Molly Clapton, was just 16. His father, Edward Walter Fryer, was a 25-year-old Canadian soldier stationed in England during World War II. Before Clapton was even born, Fryer was sent back to Canada, never to return, leaving behind a son he never met. With his father gone and his teenage mother unable to raise him, Eric was handed over to his grandparents, Rose and Jack Clapp. But rather than grow up knowing the truth, young Eric was led to believe that Rose and Jack were his actual parents, and that Patricia, his biological mother, was his much older sister. The shared surname added to the confusion, leading many to wrongly assume that Clapton's real name was Eric Clapp, when in fact it was Clapton, taken from Patricia's first husband, Reginald Cecil Clapton. Years later, Patricia remarried another Canadian soldier and moved to Germany, leaving Eric behind for good. He remained in Surrey, under the roof of the only parents he'd ever really known. It wasn't the most conventional start in life, but it shaped him. And somewhere in that quiet, tangled childhood, a spark was lit. For his 13th birthday, Eric received a cheap acoustic Hoyer guitar, made in Germany. It wasn't love at first strum. The steel strings were tough on his fingers, and the sound didn't come easily. For a while, he gave up on it. But 2 years later, he picked it up again. And this time, he didn't let go. He started practicing obsessively, drawn to the soul of the blues. He'd sit for hours, poring over old records, learning each note by ear, and playing along until the music felt like it belonged to him. He even recorded his practice sessions on a Grundig reel-to-reel tape recorder, listening to them over and over until they sounded just right. That drive, that hunger, would carry him far. By the age of 16, Clapton's talent was already turning heads. He left Hollyfield School in Surbiton and enrolled in Kingston College of Art, but his heart was never in painting. Music had taken over completely. Before the academic year ended, he was expelled for spending more time with his guitar than with a canvas. But what looked like a setback was just the beginning. He started busking around Kingston, Richmond, and London's West End, playing the blues for anyone who'd stop and listen. In 1962, he teamed up with another blues lover, Dave Brock, and the two performed in pubs across Surrey. A year later, at just 17, Clapton joined his first real band, the Roosters, a British R&B outfit where he played alongside guitarist Tom McGuinness. He stayed with them until August 1963, then briefly joined another group, Casey Jones and the Engineers, for a short 7-gig run. These were the baby steps of a legend in the making. He was still just a teenager, but Eric Clapton's journey had begun. And soon, the world would learn his name, not just as a guitarist, but as a force that would change the sound of rock forever. Making history. In those early days before the money and the mansions, Eric Clapton was just another young man hauling bricks and swinging hammers at construction sites to make ends meet. Music was his passion, but it wasn't yet his paycheck. Still, word of Clapton's talent was spreading fast across London's West End pub circuit. He was already being whispered about as one of the most gifted guitarists around, even if the crowds were small and the paychecks non-existent. Then, in October 1963, his life changed. Clapton got the call to join the Yardbirds, a rising rhythm and blues band looking for a lead guitarist. With the Yardbirds, Clapton tasted his first commercial success. Songs like Good Morning Little Schoolgirl and For Your Love began climbing the charts, giving him a foothold in the industry. But Clapton wasn't impressed. The band was drifting too far into pop territory for his liking. He had the blues in his blood, and he wasn't willing to water it down. So, in 1965, just as the band was breaking into the mainstream, Clapton walked away. Ironically, the guitarists who replaced him, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, would also go on to become rock icons. But Clapton wasn't looking back. Later that same year, he joined John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers, a band that gave him the creative space to plug back into his blues roots. In 1966, they released the Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton, a record that didn't just showcase his playing, it immortalized it. Tracks like What Did I Say and Ramblin' on My Mind confirmed what die-hard fans already knew. This wasn't just a great guitarist, this was something else entirely. Clapton's solos on the album were so electrifying, so soul-stirring, that Londoners started scrawling 3 words in spray paint across city walls and tube stations. Clapton is God. It wasn't hype, it was gospel for a generation discovering just how far the blues could go. But even divine status wasn't enough to keep him in one place for long. Not long after the album's release, Clapton left the Bluesbreakers, restless as ever. Within months, he formed a new power trio, Cream, alongside drummer Ginger Baker and bassist Jack Bruce. Cream wasn't just another blues band, it was a sonic explosion. Clapton took traditional blues standards like Crossroads and Spoonful and transformed them into fiery extended jams, while also pushing into new territory with psychedelic hits like Sunshine of Your Love and White Room. Over the next few years, they released 3 critically acclaimed albums, Fresh Cream, Disraeli Gears, and Wheels of Fire, and toured extensively, especially across the US, where fans were hungry for something raw, wild, and electric. Cream had it all, the chops, the chemistry, and the chaos. But eventually, that chaos took over. Clashing egos, especially between Bruce and Baker, turned rehearsals into war zones. After 2 final concerts at London's Royal Albert Hall, Cream disbanded in 1968. Another chapter closed. Clapton wasn't done yet. He formed Blind Faith almost immediately afterwards, teaming up again with Ginger Baker and adding Steve Winwood and Rick Gretsch. But despite the hype, Blind Faith burnt out fast. 1 album and a disastrous US tour later, they too were finished. Clapton was a genius on the guitar, but stability? That was another story entirely. The lack of stability also burnt into his love life. Eric Clapton's wild love life. Eric Clapton isn't just one of the most legendary guitarists the world has ever known, he's also one of the most talked about figures in rock, not only for the music he gave us, but for the life he lived outside the studio. From the moment he emerged on the scene in the 1960s, the English rocker lived under a spotlight that never really dimmed. And if there's one thing that stirred up nearly as much buzz as his riffs and lyrics, it's his complicated love life. It all began in the late 1960s, when a young Eric met Alice Ormsby Gore, a British aristocrat and daughter of the 5th Baron of Harlech. She was still in her late teens, and he was in his early 20s. The two quickly fell into a turbulent on-and-off romance that played out against the backdrop of fame, drugs, and something even more complicated, Eric's growing obsession with another woman, his friend and songwriting partner, George Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. Both Eric and Alice were caught in a haze of heroin use during their time together, and although rumors swirled about an engagement, nothing was ever confirmed. In 1974, their relationship ended for good, as Eric decided to pursue the woman he had been fixated on for years, Pattie. Though Alice and Eric went their separate ways, she remained close to his family. Sadly, her life came to a tragic end in 1995 when she died of a heroin overdose at the age of 42. Then there was Pattie Boyd, the woman who would become the center of one of rock's most infamous love triangles. A model, photographer, and muse, Pattie was married to none other than George Harrison of the Beatles when she caught Eric's eye. Despite their deep musical bond, Clapton fell hard for her. The tension boiled under the surface until the late 1970s when everything came to a head. After a string of affairs on both sides, Pattie and George finally divorced in 1977. Just 2 years later, in 1979, she married Eric. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale. Rock royalty united at last. But behind closed doors, the marriage was plagued by problems from the start. Both Eric and Pattie struggled with alcoholism, and even more disturbing, Pattie later revealed that Clapton had been sexually abusive during their time together. Eric's infidelity only added fuel to the fire. He carried out numerous affairs throughout their marriage, while the couple privately struggled with fertility issues, including failed IVF treatments and several miscarriages. In 1987, after years of heartbreak and betrayal, Pattie finally left. Their divorce was finalized in 1989. She found love again with property developer Rod Weston in 1991, and after years together, they married in 2015. Among the affairs that tore through Eric and Pattie's marriage, two stood out for the children they brought into his life. In 1984, Clapton began a relationship with Yvonne Kelly, the manager of AIR Studios Montserrat. Though both were married to other people at the time, their affair led to the birth of a daughter, Ruth, in 1985. Eric's paternity was kept quiet for years, until 1991, when Ruth's existence was finally made public. But it was another affair, even more tragic, that truly shattered his personal life. Not long after Ruth's birth, Clapton began seeing Italian actress and model Laurie Del Santo. Their relationship led to the birth of his son, Connor, in 1986. For a brief moment, Eric stepped into fatherhood with new purpose. Then, in 1991, tragedy struck. Connor died in a heartbreaking accident, falling from the 53rd floor window of a New York apartment building. He was just 4 years old. The grief was immeasurable. The loss of Connor not only devastated Eric, but also became the catalyst that pushed Pattie to end their already fractured marriage once and for all. Years later, in 1998, a new chapter quietly began. At a party in Columbus, Ohio, 53-year-old Eric Clapton met 22-year-old Melia McInerney, an administrative assistant. What started as a quiet romance soon became something serious. The couple kept their relationship private for the first year, but in 1999, they stepped into the public eye together. And in 2002, they married in a low-key ceremony in Surrey. Unlike his past, this time was different. Clapton has often said that Melia is the first partner he's been truly faithful to. With her, he found a sense of stability that had eluded him for decades. Together, they've built a family. Eric and Melia have 3 daughters: Julie, born in 2001, Ella, 2003, and Sophie, 2005, now all grown and living between the UK and the United States. All 3 girls share a close bond, not just with their parents, but with their half-sister Ruth, forming a blended family that, after years of chaos and loss, finally feels whole. A bitter love triangle. It's often called one of the most mythical romantic entanglements in rock and roll history. A love triangle that spawned timeless ballads, broke friendships, and forever etched 3 names into music legend: George Harrison, Pattie Boyd, and Eric Clapton. Something in the way she moves. Those words, opening one of the Beatles' most beautiful love songs, weren't just poetry. They were personal. George Harrison's 1969 ballad Something was written for his then-wife, Pattie Boyd, a stunning model and photographer whose presence seemed to magnetize rock royalty. But George wasn't the only one who saw magic in the way she moved. His best friend and frequent collaborator, Eric Clapton, fell under the same spell. Eric's infatuation with Pattie would inspire his own masterpiece, 1970's Layla, a raw, heart-wrenching cry of longing, performed with his blues rock group Derek and the Dominoes. At the time, George and Patty were still married, and from the outside, they looked solid. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to show, and out of them grew a surreal love triangle that would shape the music and the lives of everyone involved. Patty Boyd met George Harrison in 1964 when she was cast as a schoolgirl in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' debut feature film. George was smitten from the moment he saw her and asked her out that very day. She politely declined. She was dating photographer Eric Swain at the time, but inside, she was ecstatic. In a diary entry revealed decades later in 2022, she wrote, "George Harrison asked me out." The excitement didn't fade. When she was invited to the film's premiere, Patty made sure she was single just in case George asked again. He did, and this time she said yes. They began dating soon after and married on January 21, 1966. Paul McCartney, ever the loyal bandmate, served as George's best man. That same year, Eric Clapton was still riding the wave of his early fame with the Yardbirds. He and George crossed paths in late 1964 and quickly struck up a friendship rooted in their shared love for the guitar. Their bond would endure even as their bands dissolved and solo careers took flight. Clapton eventually played lead guitar on Harrison's haunting track, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, marking a historic collaboration between two of rock's greats. But it wasn't just music they shared. Spending time at George's home, Eric became increasingly drawn to Patty, so much so that he briefly dated her sister, Paula Boyd, in a feeble attempt to deflect his feelings. It didn't work. His obsession only grew deeper. It consumed him to the point that he turned to legend for solace, drawing inspiration from the 7th century tale of Layla and Majnun, a story of madness born from unrequited love. From that longing, Clapton wrote Layla, his plea for Patty to leave George and be with him. She refused. Her heart still belonged to her husband. Rejected and heartbroken, Clapton spiraled into heroin addiction and withdrew from the world, exiling himself for years. Meanwhile, things weren't so rosy behind closed doors for Patty and George either. Known as the Mystic Beatle, George had adopted Eastern philosophies and meditation, even bringing Patty along for the spiritual ride. But inner peace didn't keep his demons at bay. Cocaine use, mood swings, and an increasingly erratic temperament strained their marriage. Still, Patty tried to hold on. What finally broke her was his infidelity, most notoriously his affair with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. Patty too strayed, engaging in an affair with Ronnie Wood, then of Faces and later of the Rolling Stones. In 1974, she walked away, calling that year ludicrous and hateful. In a 2022 interview with The Telegraph, she reflected, "It was an extremely difficult decision of mine to make. I felt that I had to leave George because things were getting really out of hand. George was just being a different George. We had gone in different directions, basically, but we still loved each other." She continued, "I think he wanted to spread his wings and take advantage of being the handsome, famous, rich guy that he was and see how the girls feel about him. A hot-blooded boy. Why not, I suppose?" Their divorce was finalized on June 9, 1977. Weeks later, Clapton re-entered the picture. After years of longing, Eric finally had Patty. They began dating shortly after her divorce and married on March 27, 1979, in Tucson, Arizona. The marriage marked the culmination of Clapton's pursuit, but it wasn't the happy ending he might have imagined. Addiction once again became a major strain. Eric's alcoholism ran rampant, often leading to abusive behavior. Patty herself began drinking heavily, caught in a toxic spiral of dependency and emotional pain. Still, there were moments of beauty. One of Clapton's most beloved songs, Wonderful Tonight, was written about Patty as she got ready for Paul and Linda McCartney's annual Buddy Holly party. But love songs weren't enough. Their attempts to have children through IVF failed repeatedly, leaving deep emotional scars. Eric's infidelity returned, including a well-known affair with Italian actress Lori Del Santo, which resulted in the birth of his son, Connor, in 1986. That was the final blow. Patti left him in 1987. Their divorce was finalized 2 years later. In later interviews, she questioned the sincerity of Clapton's pursuit, saying, "Eric just wanted what George had." After her second marriage ended, Patti spiraled into a personal identity crisis. She later admitted, "Well, I was no longer Mrs. Famous George or Mrs. Famous Eric, so who am I? I am no one. No one knows me. I don't even know me." Despite all that passed between them, George and Eric's friendship endured. Remarkably. There were tensions, of course. One infamous story tells of a guitar duel at George's Friar Park home, where Eric and George battled musically for Patti's affections. Legendary actor John Hurt was reportedly there and described the atmosphere as electric. Nobody dares to say a word. Patti confirmed the incident, though Eric always denied it. Oddly enough, there was never any direct overlap between Patti's relationships with the two men. That clean handoff, so to speak, may have helped preserve their friendship. George even attended Eric and Patti's wedding and jokingly referred to himself as their husband-in-law. When Patti first told George she was dating Eric, his response was gracious. "Well, I'm glad you're going off with Eric instead of some idiot," he supposedly told her. Neither of Boyd's marriages lasted, but she had already cemented her place as one of rock and roll's most mythic muses. George's Something, So Sad, Eric's Layla, Wonderful Tonight, and Bell Bottom Blues. They all sprang from the complicated love these two men had for one woman. Patti and George remained close until his death. In her memoir, My Life in Pictures, Boyd shared a photograph taken of the two of them in the early 1990s at Friar Park, the home they once shared. "Just because things didn't work out as we planned, it didn't diminish our love for each other," she wrote. In the end, it seems there really was something in the way she moved, something that inspired, tormented, and tethered three lives in a way that even time could never quite untangle. Eric Clapton's Controversies. Rock icon Eric Clapton has long been admired for his musical genius, but behind the curtain of fame and fortune lies a story darkened by addiction, abuse, and unimaginable personal loss. For the first time, Clapton has openly admitted that during the darkest depths of his drug and alcohol dependence, he had been violent toward his first wife, model and muse, Patti Boyd. In a raw confession to the Sunday Times, Clapton reflected on how his full-blown alcoholism wreaked havoc on their marriage during the 1980s. He acknowledged that he had taken sex with Boyd by force, believing at the time that it was his entitlement. Looking back, he said he had no regard for the people around him, and that those closest to him had lived in constant fear of his unpredictable moods. Clapton recalled that people used to tread carefully around him, never knowing whether he'd return from the pub in a cheerful mood or come home and smash everything to pieces. Boyd, who had famously left ex-Beatle George Harrison to marry Clapton in 1979, had entered into a relationship fueled by passion, only to watch it unravel under the weight of addiction and emotional volatility. The marriage ended in 1988. Even at the height of his success, Clapton confessed, the darkness was always there. He admitted that despite having everything, fame, talent, and recognition, most nights he still wanted to die. As the pressure to create under the weight of public expectation intensified, Clapton said he began to spiral further into addiction. He found himself questioning not only his career, but his very identity. If he needed alcohol to write music, he wondered, then perhaps he wasn't meant to be a musician at all. He said he gave it up for a while, plagued by the question, what am I really? That painful soul-searching eventually led him toward something greater. These days, Clapton dedicates much of his time to the Crossroads Center, a drug and alcohol rehab facility he founded in Antigua. Recently, he made headlines for auctioning off 150 of his guitars, some of his most cherished instruments, to raise nearly $5 million for the center. Among them was his beloved 1956 Fender Stratocaster Brownie, the guitar on which he had written Layla, which sold for a staggering $497,500. Despite the enormous financial sacrifice, Clapton told the Sunday Times he was prepared to lose everything for the cause. He said he was willing to go down in flames because his heart was fully in it. Clapton first relocated to Antigua in 1991, seeking escape and healing after the most devastating moment of his life: the death of his 4-year-old son, Connor. The death of Connor was the beginning of self-reflection for Clapton. Losing a child. The lyrics to Tears in Heaven. Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Would it be the same? Capture the aching grief Clapton carried in the wake of that tragedy. Released in 1991, the ballad became an international hit, topping charts in over 20 countries and winning multiple Grammys, including Song of the Year and Best Male Pop Vocal Performance. But behind its tender melody lay the heartbreak that reshaped Clapton's life forever. On the morning of March 20th, 1991, Connor Clapton, the son of Eric and Italian actress Laurie Del Santo, fell to his death from a 53rd-floor Manhattan apartment. A janitor had left a window open, and Connor, just 4 years old, wandered too close. Clapton had been staying at a nearby hotel and was preparing to take Connor on a father-son outing to the Central Park Zoo. Then came the phone call. Sudden, piercing. Del Santo was on the other end, screaming that their son was gone. In a 1992 interview with British journalist Sue Lawley, Clapton remembered that moment vividly. He had been getting ready to leave the hotel, he said, when he answered the phone and heard Laurie screaming. It was too much to comprehend, and he shut down immediately. Still in a daze, he rushed to the apartment building, only to be met by chaos. Ambulances, fire trucks, and paramedics swarming the scene. Walking into the horror, Clapton said he felt completely detached, as though he had stepped into someone else's nightmare. He admitted it no longer felt like his life, and even years later, he said, that sense of disconnection hadn't gone away. Connor's funeral was held just 2 days before Clapton's 46th birthday. The loss was unspeakable. It crushed him, and yet, in a strange and bittersweet twist, it also became the reason he stayed sober. Clapton had already faced down many demons before Connor's birth. He had kicked heroin in the late 70s, but alcohol and cocaine still gripped him tightly. When Connor arrived in 1986, Clapton knew something had to change. He couldn't be that man around his son. In his memoir, Clapton, the autobiography, he wrote that he got sober for Connor. He said he couldn't bear the thought of his son growing up and forming an image of him based on the version of himself that existed then. Inspired by fatherhood, he stayed sober for 3 years. And then came the accident. By all logic, it could have undone everything, but instead, it deepened his commitment. He withdrew into grief, splitting his time between Antigua and England, immersing himself in music and recovery meetings. From that season of mourning came 2 of his most personal songs. One was Circus Left Town, recounting the last night he spent with Connor at a circus. The other was Tears in Heaven, a song so intimate Clapton initially never intended to release it. But he was encouraged to include it on the soundtrack for the 1991 film Rush, and later performed it on MTV Unplugged in 1992, sharing his sorrow with the world. What began as private mourning became a global anthem. Tears in Heaven went on to become Clapton's best-selling U.S. single and a timeless ballad of love, loss, and letting go. Connor's death left an unfillable void, but it also opened the door to reconnection. Clapton's daughter, Ruth Kelly Clapton, had been born a year before Connor, the child of Clapton and Yvonne Kelly, a studio manager from Montserrat. After the tragedy, Yvonne reached out and offered him the chance to build a relationship with Ruth. Clapton embraced it. In his memoir, he reflected on how healing it was just to be around a child again, his child. Over time, through shared moments and growing trust, he and Ruth forged a bond that became essential to his recovery. Looking back, Clapton said Ruth had been important to his healing. She gave him something real to care about, he explained. She gave him purpose. In many ways, he added, she saved his life. Eric Clapton's story is not just about music or fame, it's about reckoning, redemption, and the long road to healing. Behind the blues licks and iconic riffs is a man who stared down his demons, faced the wreckage of his past, and decided to fight for a different future. One note, one day, one quiet miracle at a time. What do you think about the love triangle between Eric Clapton, Pattie Boyd, and George Harrison? Do you think Clapton genuinely loved Boyd, or do you think otherwise? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.